The first thing Imani Brooks noticed was the sound. Not laughter exactly. Laughter has warmth. But the brittle chime of champagne glasses colliding, sharp and celebratory, echoing upward through concrete and glass. It rose from somewhere below, drifting into the high-rise condo like an uninvited guest. The kind of sound that says something irreversible has already happened. Imani stood barefoot on the cool, hardwood floor, her heels abandoned by the door, her coat still on as if she hadn't fully arrived in her own life. Outside the windows, Chicago glittered in its winter confidence, Lake Michigan a sheet of black glass reflecting nothing back. She had lived in this view for 8 months, long enough to mistake it for permanence. Her phone vibrated once on the kitchen island. She didn't pick it up immediately. Some instinct older than reason told her that whatever waited on that screen would split her life cleanly into before and after. When she finally looked, it wasn't a message meant for her. It was an announcement. Ethan Caldwell's name sat at the top of her screen, tagged in a photo already gathering likes at an alarming speed. He was standing in a room she recognized instantly, the Sinclair Foundation ballroom, all restored brass and civic gravitas, his hand resting on the waist of a blonde woman in a silk gown the color of old money. Marin Sinclair, philanthropy executive, board darling, Midwest legacy royalty. The caption was brief, efficient. When you know, you know. Imani felt the words before she understood them. A pressure behind her eyes, a hollowing in her chest, as if something essential had been quietly removed while she wasn't looking. 6 weeks ago, Ethan had been planning a trip with her. 3 nights ago, he'd kissed her forehead and said he was exhausted, said he had meetings, said they'd talk tomorrow. Tomorrow had arrived without her. Downstairs, the elevator chimed. More laughter. The celebration continued. If this opening already has you holding your breath, if you recognize that moment when a life-shaping truth arrives to a screen instead of a conversation, stay with me. And if stories about quiet betrayals, public replacements, and women who refuse to disappear speak to something in you, you're welcome to like, comment, or follow along. It helps these stories find the people who need them most. Imani scrolled despite herself. Photos bloomed one after another, Ethan smiling in that practiced way he reserved for donors and decision-makers. Marin's hand lifted to show a ring that caught the light without asking permission. Comments poured in. Perfect match. Power couple. So right for each other. No one asked where the woman before her had gone. Imani set the phone down carefully, like it might shatter if she didn't. She walked to the window and pressed her palm against the glass. Her reflection hovered there, faint but unmistakable. A black woman in her early 30s, hair pulled back too tightly, wearing a tailored coat Ethan had suggested because it looked credible. She looked like someone who had been edited for context. 8 months earlier, she had still lived in her own apartment on the South Side, walls crowded with maps and whiteboards from community projects she believed in. She had met Ethan at a civic innovation panel where she spoke about equitable redevelopment without softening her language. He'd approached her afterward with that intent gaze, told her she was refreshing, told her she made the room feel honest. "You're not like the others," he'd said. She hadn't yet learned what that usually meant. The condo around her was immaculate, curated down to the last neutral throw pillow. Nothing here had fingerprints. Nothing here had history. Most of her things were in storage now, temporary, Ethan had said, until they figured out what fit the space. She wondered, suddenly, if she had been temporary too. A compelling phase, an idea that worked until something more suitable arrived. Her phone buzzed again, a text this time. "Where are you?" Ethan wrote. "We need to talk." Imani laughed once. It came out thin, almost polite. Talk. As if the room downstairs hadn't already delivered his conclusion with champagne and applause. As if she hadn't learned the truth the way women so often do now, through social media, through whispers, through the careless efficiency of public celebration. She didn't reply. Instead, she walked to the elevator, the quiet hum loud in her ears. As the doors slid open, she caught her reflection in the mirrored steel. For a moment, she barely recognized herself. She looked smaller somehow, contained, like a woman who had learned how to stand in rooms that were never built for her and mistake survival for belonging. The elevator began its descent. Somewhere below, Ethan Caldwell was announcing his future. And somewhere between floors, Imani Brooks felt something inside her shift. Not breaking yet, but loosening. The first warning tremor before a life rearranges itself completely. Imani met Ethan Caldwell on a night she almost didn't attend. The panel had been long, the questions predictable, the room heavy with the polite exhaustion of people who wanted to sound progressive, without committing to anything that might inconvenience them. By the time Imani stepped down from the stage, her throat was dry and her patience thinner than she liked to admit. She was already calculating how quickly she could leave when she noticed him standing near the aisle, hands loosely clasped, watching her with an attention that felt deliberate, not hungry, not impressed, assessing. "Imani Brooks," he said when she approached, as if her name had already settled comfortably in his mouth. "You didn't soften a single sentence." She smiled, reflexive and guarded. "I'm not sure how that would have helped the neighborhoods I work with." "That's exactly my point," he replied. "Most people translate themselves to survive rooms like this. You didn't." Later, she would recognize that moment for what it was. The first incision. Clean, precise, almost flattering enough to miss the blood. They talked while the room emptied around them. Ethan asked about her work, not in the vague, congratulatory way donors often did, but with focused curiosity. He wanted to know how community trust was measured, how power moved invisibly through zoning boards and public-private partnerships, how projects failed when optics mattered more than people. When she spoke, he listened like someone gathering valuable intelligence. "You think structurally," he said at one point. "That's rare." She laughed. "In my world, it's survival. In mine," he said, "it's leverage." Ethan was a partner-track executive at Caldwell and Rowe, a private investment firm whose name carried weight in Chicago without ever needing to announce itself loudly. Old money, but not sloppy about it. Strategic, disciplined. He spoke easily about markets and governance, about capital as if it were a language he'd learned before speech. Yet he never once interrupted her, never corrected her. He let her finish every thought. That alone made him feel different. When he invited her to dinner a week later, she hesitated. Not because she didn't want to go, but because she recognized the familiar calculation rising in her chest. How to dress, how to speak, how much of herself to reveal without triggering the silent reclassification that always seemed to follow Black women when rooms decided they'd seen too much. Ethan chose the restaurant. Quiet, understated, no visible prices on the menu. He asked about her childhood on the South Side, about her mother's insistence on practicality, about the way Imani had learned early to be fluent in both urgency and restraint. He remembered details, repeated her words back to her later in the evening, slightly refined as if polishing them. "You're not like the people I usually date," he said over dessert, as though confiding something generous. Imani's smile tightened. "How so?" "They're comfortable," he said. "They understand the rules of my world, but they don't question them. You do." She should have heard the warning embedded in the praise. Comfortable meant compatible. Questioning meant temporary. But Ethan made questioning feel like a privilege instead of a risk. He invited her into spaces she'd never asked to enter. Fundraisers where city leaders leaned in when he spoke. Private dinners where decisions were made between courses. He introduced her as someone brilliant, someone doing important work, someone who made him think. And slowly, without ever asking directly, he began to position her. He suggested she come to events as herself, then gently redirected her when her presence disrupted the unspoken tone. He explained which donors needed reassurance, which conversations required deference, which truths were better delivered privately. He framed it as guidance, protection, partnership. "I just don't want you misunderstood," he said once, after correcting her phrasing in front of a board member. Imani nodded, swallowing the irritation that flickered through her. She told herself it was collaboration, growth. She told herself this was how access worked. There were moments, though, small and sharp, when something didn't sit right. When a senior associate joked about optics and Ethan didn't challenge it. When Marin Sinclair's name surfaced in conversation more than seemed necessary. When Ethan spoke about legacy as if it were a responsibility that outweighed personal cost. But then he'd look at Imani with that same intent focus. Tell her she was refreshing. Tell her she was different. Tell her she made him feel like he wasn't just managing an inheritance. And Imani, who had spent her life fighting to be seen without being diminished, mistook being chosen for being understood. She didn't yet see that Ethan hadn't fallen in love with her freedom. He'd selected her for what she represented in that moment. Insight without threat, brilliance without inheritance, difference without permanence. A compelling asset, a story that worked until it didn't. By the time she realized she'd been chosen the way firms choose pilot programs, valuable, provisional, subject to replacement, she was already standing in rooms that would later watch her disappear. And Ethan Caldwell, who prided himself on making clean decisions, had already begun calculating what came next. The rules of Ethan's world were never written down. They were felt, in the pause before a laugh, in the way people lowered their voices when certain names entered the room, in the subtle choreography of who spoke first and who summarized at the end. Imani learned them the way immigrants learn a language they can't afford to mispronounce, by watching, by adjusting, by swallowing questions that would cost too much to ask. At her first donor dinner, she noticed how everyone waited for Ethan to arrive before sitting, even though no one said it outright. When he did, the conversation rearranged itself around him, like iron filings finding a magnet. People asked him about the market, about policy shifts, about things they pretended were intellectual curiosities, but were really forecasts of advantage. When he introduced Imani, heads tilted, curious, approving, measuring. "This is Imani," Ethan said. "She's doing fascinating work in community strategy." Fascinating. Not influential, not decisive, not threatening. She smiled anyway and answered questions with the careful clarity she'd honed over years of public meetings where one wrong word could kill a project. Someone asked if her work was scalable. Another wanted to know if her neighborhoods were investable. A third congratulated her on finding a seat at the table. Imani realized, then, that this table had conditions. Ethan moved through it with ease. He knew when to interrupt and when to defer, when to signal agreement with a raised eyebrow, when to let silence do the work. He began to coach her, never harshly, always framed as care. "That donor is sensitive to tone," he'd murmur after an exchange. "You're right, but next time, soften the delivery." Or, "That's a great point, just maybe not in this room." It was the kind of guidance that came with a price tag you only saw later. Marin Sinclair appeared more frequently as the weeks passed. She was everywhere without seeming to try. On boards, at benefits, in group texts that materialized out of nowhere. When she and Imani finally spoke at length, it was disarmingly pleasant. Marin asked real questions. She listened. She laughed easily without checking the room for permission. She spoke about philanthropy with the confidence of someone who had never had to prove she belonged there. "You must be exhausted," Marin said once, touching Imani's arm lightly. "The emotional labor alone." Imani blinked, unsure whether to feel seen or sorted. Later, Ethan explained that Marin had incredible instincts and an intuitive grasp of people. He said it the way one might describe a natural resource. Imani noticed how often Marin's name surfaced when legacy donors were discussed, how easily doors opened in her presence, how little she needed to explain. At another dinner, a senior partner joked about urban messiness and glanced at Imani as if waiting to see how she'd take it. Ethan laughed first, quick, smoothing, deflecting. We're all learning, he said, and the moment passed. Imani felt the familiar heat of being invited to absorb a blow so the room could remain comfortable. Afterward, Ethan squeezed her hand. I handled that, he said quietly. Trust me. Trust became the refrain. Trust that he knew the terrain. Trust that compromise now meant leverage later. Trust that the parts of her he asked her to soften would be returned once the timing was right. He encouraged her to attend fewer community meetings. Delegate, you're bigger than that now. He suggested she streamline her wardrobe. You're representing more than yourself. He advised her to avoid certain media interviews. They'll frame it wrong. Each suggestion arrived wrapped in logic. Each one made sense on its own. Together, they formed a narrowing corridor. Imani told herself this was growth, that proximity to power required adaptation, that she wasn't disappearing, she was being refined. She ignored the quiet discomfort of realizing she no longer knew how to speak without scanning the room first. One evening, as they stood on Ethan's balcony overlooking the city, he spoke about his family's expectations, about legacy, about how certain partnerships required stability and alignment. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a pressure he rarely admitted. My father believes perception is a form of governance, he said. He thinks disorder invites risk. Imani watched the city lights pulse below them. And where do I fit into that? Ethan hesitated, just long enough. You complicate things, he said finally, then smiled as if it were a compliment. In a good way, she laughed because the alternative was to ask what complication cost and who would pay it. By the time she noticed that her calendar no longer contained the work that had once grounded her, by the time she realized that her voice had learned new limits, the fine print had already been signed, not with ink, but with silence, with the hope that love could make room where power rarely did. And somewhere in Ethan's world, quietly, efficiently, the calculus had begun to shift. It didn't happen all at once. That was the most dangerous part. Imani did not wake up one morning and decide to abandon herself. There was no dramatic announcement, no slammed door, no conscious trade of purpose for comfort. The shrinking arrived in increments so small they passed for reason, for maturity, for love. Ethan suggested she move into his condo on a Thursday night, standing in the kitchen as if the idea had just occurred to him. You're here most nights anyway, he said, pouring wine with the casual authority of someone used to decisions being received, not questioned. It would simplify things. Simplify. The words slid between them like a promise. Imani hesitated. Her apartment on the south side was modest but alive. Neighbors who knocked without texting, walls crowded with notes from projects still unfinished. It was hers. But Ethan spoke of logistics, of safety, of the inefficiency of maintaining two lives when they were clearly building one. She told herself this was what commitment looked like. The boxes were packed faster than she expected. Some of her things made it upstairs. Others were labeled storage and disappeared into a unit she never visited. Ethan's condo absorbed her the way water absorbs dye, quietly, completely, without acknowledging the change. The space still looked like him. It just contained less of her. Around the same time, she began stepping back from work. Not leaving, never leaving, but redistributing responsibilities. Ethan framed it as strategy. You don't need to be in every room anymore, he said. That's not how influence works. He said it gently, almost proudly, as if he were ushering her into a higher class of existence. When her director at the nonprofit asked why Imani was suddenly unavailable for meetings she'd once led, Imani heard herself say, I'm focusing on bigger picture alignment. The phrase sounded foreign even as it left her mouth. She told herself this was growth, that no one climbed without shedding something. She stopped wearing the clothes that made her feel expansive. Ethan didn't ask her to. He simply suggested alternatives. Cleaner lines, quieter colors, pieces that photographed well. You're representing more than yourself now, he'd say, and she let the statement land as aspiration instead of warning. The first real fracture came disguised as opportunity. A city task force had been formed, high profile, publicly visible, and Imani was asked to co-chair it. The project aligned perfectly with the work she'd been building toward for years. It would mean press, leverage, the ability to set terms instead of responding to them. She came home vibrating, words tumbling over each other as she explained it to Ethan. He listened without interrupting, his expression carefully neutral. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "That's significant," he said. Then after a pause, "The timing is complicated." Complicated turned out to mean Lake Geneva, the annual Caldwell retreat, donors, partners, legacy families, a weekend where alliances were cemented and futures quietly arranged. Ethan had already told people she'd be there. "We need to show up as a unit," he said. "It matters." Imani tried to negotiate. Maybe she could attend the first day of the task force meetings and join him after. Maybe she could send a deputy. Ethan corrected her, not sharply, but firmly. "This isn't about logistics," he said. "It's about coherence. We can't look divided." "We." The word pressed against her ribs. She withdrew her name from the task force the next morning, told herself there would be others, told herself she was choosing partnership over ego. When her director looked at her with something like confusion, something like disappointment, Imani looked away. That night, alone in the bathroom, she stared at her reflection and felt an unfamiliar distance. Her face looked composed, controlled, like someone who had learned when to stop asking for things. The shrinking accelerated after that. Ethan's schedule always came first. His stress was always urgent. His world always required her flexibility. When she tried to explain the aches she felt, vague but persistent, he reminded her of how much he'd brought into her life, of the access, of the stability, of how rare it was to be included. "You're overthinking," he'd say, and she'd nod because challenging him meant risking the fragile equilibrium she'd worked so hard to maintain. Marin Sinclair appeared again at a benefit, radiant and effortless, slipping into conversations Imani no longer felt entitled to interrupt. Marin asked how she was doing, genuinely, and Imani surprised herself by answering, "Busy," because it was easier than the truth. The truth was that Imani had become a guest in her own life. She stopped writing proposals, stopped calling colleagues who reminded her of who she'd been, stopped noticing how often she waited for Ethan's cues before speaking in rooms where she used to lead. And the most unsettling part was this. The more she shrank, the easier things became between them. Fewer disagreements, fewer corrections, more approval. It felt, briefly, like peace. But peace that requires disappearance is not peace. It's erasure in slow motion. By the time Imani sensed the cost, by the time she realized that the woman she was becoming could fit neatly into spaces that once rejected her, it was already too late to pretend nothing had been lost. The email arrived at 9:12 a.m. on a Monday, the kind of ordinary timestamp that should not be allowed to change a person's life. Imani was at her desk at the nonprofit, half a cup of coffee cooling beside a stack of community impact reports, when the subject line lit up her screen. Confidential, city partnership announcement. She opened it, expecting another request for input, another polite invitation to do labor behind the scenes while someone else took the microphone. Instead, she read her own name and felt her body go weightless. The mayor's office wanted her as the public lead on a new initiative, an ambitious redevelopment project built around anti-displacement protections, small business funding, and a transparent community oversight model. The kind of work she had been pushing toward for years. The kind of work that would put her in front of cameras, at podiums, in rooms where policy stopped being theoretical and became real. They weren't offering her a seat at the table. They were offering her the pen. She read the email twice, then a third time, just to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. A grin broke across her face so fast it felt like permission. Her fingers shook as she forwarded it to her director, then to her closest colleague, then, after a second of hesitation, to Ethan. She didn't wait for his reply. She wanted to tell him in person, to see the pride in his face, to hear him say what she needed so badly to hear. Yes, this is you. This is what you're built for. That night, she arrived at his condo early, before his meetings ended, and set the table the way he liked. Clean lines, minimal clutter, nothing that looked too eager. When Ethan finally walked in, tie loosened, phone still in hand, she stood and said it all in one breath. "They want me to lead it," she said, publicly. "It's a major initiative. It's exactly what I've been building toward." Ethan looked up, and for a fraction of a second, his expression was pure, surprise, maybe even admiration. Then the calculation returned, subtle as a shadow sliding across a wall. "That's big," he said slowly. "It's huge," she corrected, laughing, unable to contain it. "It's the biggest professional moment of my life." He nodded again, but his eyes had already drifted somewhere else, as if he were scanning an invisible calendar. He set his phone down face up, always face up, and poured himself water instead of wine. "When is the announcement?" he asked. 3 weeks, Imani said. "They want to move fast. Press conference, stakeholder roundtable, the whole thing. My name will be attached." Ethan's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. 3 weeks, he repeated, as if tasting the words for danger. Imani's excitement faltered. "What?" He exhaled, the sound practiced. "That weekend is the Lake Geneva retreat." For a moment, she didn't understand. She stared at him, blinking, as if her brain needed time to translate the absurdity into meaning. "The retreat," Ethan continued, "is when we finalize the institutional partnership. My father's been working on it for a year. Donors will be there, people who don't come to anything else. It's important." Imani felt something in her chest tighten. "Okay," she said carefully. "So I go to the press conference and then I join you after. Or I fly up that night. It's Chicago, not..." "It's not about distance," Ethan cut in, still calm. "It's about optics." There it was. The word that always meant the same thing. Be smaller so the room stays comfortable. Imani swallowed. Optics for who? Ethan stared at her, as if she were being willfully difficult. "For them," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the unseen empire of Caldwell and Rowe. "For the people who need to see that I'm stable, that my life isn't..." He searched for a word that wouldn't sound like what it was. "Complicated." Imani's throat went dry. "My job is complicated?" He rubbed a hand over his mouth, impatient now. "Your work is political," he said. "Public-facing. It attracts attention. You know how narratives get spun. My family doesn't like surprises." "And I'm a surprise," she said, the sentence landing between them like broken glass. Ethan didn't deny it. He softened instead, the way men do when they want compliance without conflict. He stepped closer, touched her arm, smiled in that intimate, persuasive way that had once made her feel chosen. "Baby," he said, "this is a partnership. Sometimes that means we prioritize the bigger picture." Imani stared at him. The bigger picture. As if her life were a detail that could be moved around the edges of his. She felt anger rise, hot and bright, but beneath it was something worse. The old fear that if she insisted on herself, she would lose him. That insistence would make her difficult, and difficult women didn't get kept. She tried one more time. "This is my career," she said. "This is what I've worked for." Ethan's expression tightened. "And you'll have more opportunities," he said. "But this weekend is not replaceable." Imani almost laughed at the irony. Not replaceable. As if she hadn't been learning the opposite lesson for months. She went quiet. She felt herself doing it. The familiar internal retreat, the self-editing, the calculation of what tone would keep the peace. She nodded, slowly, like someone agreeing to a weather forecast. "I'll talk to them," she heard herself say. "I'll figure it out." Ethan's shoulders relaxed immediately. He kissed her temple, satisfied, and murmured, "Thank you," as if she'd given him a gift instead of giving something away. The next morning, Imani withdrew from the announcement. Her director didn't yell, That would have been easier. Instead, he stared at her for a long moment with an expression that looked like grief. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. Imani forced her voice steady. "I'm sure." She walked out of his office and went into the restroom, locked the stall, and pressed her fist against her mouth to keep from making a sound. She didn't cry, not yet. She just sat there perfectly still, while her body processed the truth her mind kept trying to deny. Some choices are designed to look voluntary, and the moment you accept one, you teach the world exactly how much of you it can ask you to surrender. After the choice, the house grew quieter. Not in the obvious way. Ethan still took calls, still paced during late-night negotiations, still filled the rooms with the low hum of his importance. But something essential went missing. The laughter they used to share while cooking, the loose conversations that wandered nowhere and mattered anyway. In their place was efficiency, order, a calm that felt earned rather than lived in. Imani told herself this was adulthood. That peace often arrived disguised as routine, but her body disagreed. She noticed it first in the mornings. Ethan woke earlier now, already dressed when she stirred, his phone glowing in his hand like a second pulse. He angled the screen away without thinking, a reflex so practiced it barely registered as intention. When she asked about his day, his answers shortened, compressed into summaries that left no space for follow-up. "Busy," he'd say. "Same as always." "Same" had become a shield. Marin Sinclair's name appeared more often, drifting into conversations under the guise of logistics. Marin would be at the retreat. Marin had a thought about donor engagement. Marin had mentioned something interesting at a board dinner. Ethan spoke her name casually, as if repetition might drain it of meaning. Imani felt a faint tightening each time, a quiet internal flinch she dismissed as insecurity. She told herself she was being unfair. Marin was part of his world. Marin had always been part of his world. That didn't mean anything had changed, except things had. One evening, they attended a benefit together, and Imani realized halfway through that no one was asking her questions anymore. People nodded politely, smiled, then redirected their attention back to Ethan, or to Marin, who had joined them midway through the night. Marin moved easily, touching arms, remembering names, laughing at exactly the right volume. When she and Ethan spoke, their heads leaned together in unconscious symmetry. Imani stood beside them, silent, holding a glass she hadn't touched. Later in the car, she mentioned it. "Did you notice how comfortable you two seem tonight?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're reading into things," he said too quickly. "Marin's just good at people." The conversation ended there, sealed shut by his certainty. Imani stared out the window and watched the city slide past, its streets full of lives that did not require this level of interpretation to survive. The signs multiplied, each one small enough to ignore on its own. Ethan began taking calls in the other room. Not all of them, just some. He started replying to messages late at night, the light from his phone cutting across the ceiling while he thought she was asleep. When she shifted, he'd roll away slightly, murmuring, "Go back to sleep." She stopped asking questions that led nowhere. At work, she struggled to focus. The projects she'd stepped back from continued without her, their successes announced in emails where her name appeared only in passing, if at all. She told herself this was temporary, that she'd chosen this, that she was still in control. But control feels different when you have it. One afternoon, while Ethan was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Just once, a soft, intimate sound. Imani glanced at it reflexively, then froze. The message preview glowed against the dark screen. "Saturday, finally, feels like the beginning of everything." There was no name attached, just a set of initials she recognized instantly. Her heart slowed in a way that frightened her. Not racing, not panicking, stilling, like an animal that has realized escape is unlikely. Saturday, the retreat. Imani sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone as if it might explain itself. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. The meaning had already arranged itself in her chest with brutal clarity. When Ethan emerged from the bathroom, steam clinging to his skin, She looked up at him. For a moment, she saw him the way she had in the beginning, confident, composed, convinced of his own coherence. She wondered how long he'd known, how long he'd been preparing the ground. "You okay?" he asked, noticing her stillness. "Yeah," she said automatically. "Just tired." He nodded, satisfied, and reached for his phone. The screen went dark in his hand. That night, Imani lay awake listening to his breathing, counting the seconds between inhales. Her mind replayed moments she'd brushed aside. The half-answers, the recalibrations, the way he'd begun to look past her in rooms she'd once helped him navigate. She understood something then, not all at once, but enough to hurt. The signals had been there, not hidden, just inconvenient. And she had ignored them because acknowledging them would have required a question she wasn't ready to ask. What happens to me if I stop being agreeable? In the dark, with the city murmuring beyond the glass, Imani pressed her hand against her chest and felt the weight of what she'd traded for peace. She did not cry. She did not move. She simply lay there, very still, as the truth settled in beside her. Quiet, undeniable, and far too late to pretend it hadn't been knocking all along. The invitation arrived embossed and heavy, the kind of paper that assumed acceptance before it ever reached your hands. The Sinclair Foundation annual benefit, black tie, historic venue, an evening celebrating leadership and legacy. Ethan placed it on the kitchen counter like it was a formality, not a test. "It'll be a long night," he said, already distracted, already somewhere else. "But it matters." Imani nodded. Everything mattered lately, just never the things that belonged to her. On the afternoon of the gala, Ethan moved through the condo with restless efficiency, taking calls, changing ties, recalibrating his reflection in the mirror. He asked Imani to help him choose a tuxedo, holding 2 jackets up side by side. "This one," she said, pointing to the darker cut. "It photographs better. Less glare." He smiled, approving. "You always know." The words landed with a dull ache. She wondered, briefly, what else she'd helped him prepare for without knowing. She dressed last, stood in front of the mirror longer than she meant to, trying on versions of herself like costumes. The dress she chose was elegant but restrained, structured lines, nothing that demanded attention. Armor disguised as taste. She pinned her hair back the way Ethan preferred, clean and controlled, and told herself it didn't matter. The car ride downtown was quiet. Ethan checked his phone repeatedly, jaw tight, eyes distant. When Imani asked if everything was okay, he squeezed her hand without looking at her. "Just work," he said. The venue glowed when they arrived, all restored stone and soft lighting meant to flatter power. Inside, the air buzzed with practiced warmth, laughter calibrated to be overheard, greetings exchanged like currency. The city's most influential names moved through the space as if it belonged to them, because in many ways, it did. Ethan was intercepted almost immediately. A board member clasped his shoulder. A donor pulled him into conversation. Imani stood beside him, smiling when cued, holding a glass she didn't drink from. She felt herself slipping into a familiar role, supportive, polished, silent. That's when she saw Marin. She stood across the room near the bar, wrapped in a gown that caught the light effortlessly, as if the room had been designed for her entrance. Her hair was pinned up, exposing her neck, her posture relaxed in the way of someone who had never needed to earn ease. She laughed at something someone said, a real laugh, unguarded. Imani felt it before she understood it. A sudden drop, like missing a step in the dark. Marin's gaze lifted, found Ethan instantly. The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. Recognition, familiarity, something like relief. She excused herself from her group and began weaving through the crowd with quiet purpose, the way people do when they know exactly where they're going. Ethan's hand slipped from Imani's arm. "I need to take care of something," he said, already stepping away. "Stay here." The words echoed after him. Imani watched, frozen, as Marin reached him near the edge of the room. She watched Marin straighten Ethan's tie, a gesture so intimate and practiced It felt like a confession. She watched Ethan lean in, his body angling toward Marin as if pulled by gravity. They didn't look around. They didn't look at her. They turned together and disappeared toward the terrace doors, into the cold night air beyond the glass. For a moment, the room tilted. Sound receded. Imani felt her body respond before her mind could catch up. Heat rushing to her face, a hollow spreading in her chest. She moved without fully deciding to, following at a distance, her heels silent on the polished floor. She didn't reach the terrace. A woman's voice stopped her, smooth and sympathetic. Imani, dear. She turned to see a society fixture she recognized vaguely, someone who'd always looked at her like a question mark. The woman's eyes flicked toward the terrace, then back to Imani's face. Are you all right? She asked softly. You look lost. Imani opened her mouth, closed it. I'm fine, she said, but the word cracked, betraying her. The woman's expression shifted, pity, quick and sharp. Oh, she said, you didn't know. The sentence landed like a verdict. Imani became aware of the room again, the way conversations slowed, how eyes turned and lingered. The machinery of wealth and observation had noticed a disruption and was adjusting accordingly. She felt exposed, mislabeled, already archived as a cautionary tale. She excused herself without ceremony and found the restroom, marble and gold, a sanctuary built for appearances. Inside a stall, she pressed her palms to her thighs and tried to breathe. Footsteps, voices. I give it 10 minutes, someone said, bright with champagne and cruelty, before she makes a scene. Can you blame her? Another replied. Replaced by Marin Sinclair? That's not even a fair comparison. He was clearly trading up. Honestly, bringing her tonight was strategic. Clean break, public, no confusion. Their laughter echoed against stone. Imani stayed perfectly still, not crying, not moving, understanding, with a clarity that hurt more than tears, what she had been in this room. Not a partner, not a presence, a placeholder. When she finally emerged, her reflection looked unfamiliar. Eyes too bright, makeup slightly smudged, the dress suddenly a disguise she no longer wanted to wear. She left through a side corridor, past staff who looked away with professional kindness, and stepped into the cold Chicago night. The city did not pause for her humiliation. Cars streamed past, lights shimmered. Somewhere behind her, the gala continued uninterrupted. Imani walked until the air burned her lungs, until the noise dulled, until the truth settled fully into place. This had not been an accident. It had been arranged. And the trap wasn't the betrayal. It was that she had been invited to witness her own replacement and expected to accept it quietly. The restroom felt like a museum exhibit dedicated to discretion. Marble veined like pale lightning, gold fixtures polished to the point of arrogance, mirrors framed in heavy ornamentation as if vanity required architecture. Everything gleamed with money's particular kind of cleanliness, the kind that says nothing messy should ever be admitted here. Not tears, not rage, not a woman realizing she has been publicly erased. Imani locked herself into the farthest stall and sat down fully clothed, back against the cool partition. Her breath came shallow, as if the air itself had become expensive and therefore scarce. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth and listened for her heartbeat, trying to prove she still occupied her own body. Outside, the gala continued as a muffled soundtrack. Laughter, music, the soft rise and fall of conversations that would never include her truth. She stared at the stall door, at the metal latch, at the small gap near the floor where the world insisted on watching even when you begged for privacy. Then the restroom door opened again. Footsteps, several pairs, heels clicking in synchronized confidence. Imani froze. A voice floated in first, bright, amused, sharpened by champagne. I give it 10 minutes, the woman said, before she makes a scene. Another laugh followed, lighter, as if cruelty could be a group activity. You can't really blame her, can't you? the first voice replied. I mean, she knew what she was, didn't she? Come on, that man is Caldwell. They don't do chaos long term. Imani's throat tightened. Her hands gripped the edge of her dress until her fingers ached. A third voice joined, lower, almost sympathetic. It's still humiliating. Bringing her tonight? That's cold. It's strategic, the first woman said immediately, as if correcting a child. This is how these people do endings. Publicly, cleanly, so no one has to wonder who won. Won. As if love were a contest and she had been foolish enough to enter without knowing the rules. Another woman sighed theatrically. And honestly, Maren Sinclair, that's not even fair. That's not a replacement. That's an upgrade. Imani felt the word upgrade like a slap. She's board tier, someone added. She's legacy. Her network is permanent. That's what it is, the first voice said, pleased with herself. Permanence. Maren comes with permanence. Imani comes with complications. Complications. The same word Ethan had used. Suddenly it sounded like a verdict passed from room to room, from family to firm to foundation, until it became common sense. The third voice hesitated. Imani's smart, though, and she's beautiful, and she's done real work. Yes, the first woman agreed, too quickly, too sweetly. She's a great story. But stories aren't the same thing as a partner. A story is something you feature for a season. A partner is something you build a legacy with. Imani's eyes stung. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears spill where they could be heard. Her pride rose up like a protective animal, raw and desperate. Another woman laughed. I'm just shocked she didn't figure it out sooner. Men like that don't choose with their hearts. They choose with spreadsheets. There was a beat of silence, then a chorus of quiet amusement. He's consolidating, someone said, delighted with the word. Exactly, the first voice replied. He's consolidating. And he gets to look like the good guy because it's all wrapped in philanthropy and flowers. The third voice, still the one with the faint edge of discomfort, murmured, It's cruel. Cruel. The word lingered. Then the first voice hardened. Cruel is the point. Cruel teaches lessons. Cruel keeps people from thinking they can reach above their bracket. A pause, and then, softly, like a secret everyone already knew, you can't blame him for choosing what fits. Fits. As if she were a garment that didn't match the room. Imani stared at the seam where the stall door met the frame. The gap was narrow but merciless. She imagined them standing at the sinks, touching up lipstick, checking themselves in the mirror, speaking about her like she was not even nearby, like she was already gone. She felt something shift inside her, not breaking, not healing, hardening. Because the humiliation wasn't only Ethan's betrayal. It was the casualness of the audience. The way they made her pain entertainment. The way they spoke as if this was inevitable. As if her existence in Ethan's world had always been a clerical error that was finally corrected. She waited until their voices drifted out the door again, laughter fading like perfume. When the restroom finally went quiet, Imani stood. Her knees trembled, not from weakness, but from the body's refusal to pretend this was normal. She looked down at her hands and realized her nails had left crescent marks in her palms. She stepped out of the stall and faced the mirror. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her eyes were too bright, her expression too controlled, like someone wearing composure the way you wear a bandage. Tight enough to stop the bleeding, not enough to heal the wound. Imani leaned closer. She could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, evidence of smiling on cue. She could see the way her jaw held tension, the way her shoulders angled inward as if trying to take up less space. A phrase drifted through her mind, sudden and merciless. I have been shrinking for so long, I thought it was love. She reached for a paper towel, dabbed carefully beneath her eyes, repaired what she could without granting the mirror a victory. Then she straightened, lifted her chin, and walked out of the restroom like someone who still belonged to herself. But as she moved through the corridor toward the exit, she understood something with terrible clarity. The bathroom chorus wasn't just gossip. It was a warning, and if she didn't listen now, she would spend the rest of her life learning what it meant to be discussed like an object in a room where no one ever bothered to say her name with respect. Imani left through a service corridor that smelled faintly of disinfectant and expensive flowers dying too early. A staff member held a door open without meeting her eyes, the practiced courtesy of someone trained to protect the illusion. Outside, the wind off the lake sliced through her dress, as if Chicago itself had decided she deserved a cleaner pain. She walked fast, then faster, heels clicking unevenly on the sidewalk. The city glittered like nothing had happened. Cars slid past with their warm interiors and their music turned low. A group of people laughed outside a restaurant, breath fogging in the cold. Life kept moving, indifferent and relentless. Her phone vibrated. Once, twice, 3 times. She didn't look until she reached the shadowed side of the building, where the noise of the gala dulled behind stone. When she finally turned her screen on, Ethan's name filled it. "Where are you? We need to talk." The messages were blandly urgent, the tone of a man trying to contain an outcome he could no longer manage. Imani stared at the words and felt something inside her detach, like a clasp finally snapping loose. She did not reply. She opened her contacts instead and blocked his number. The action was small, just a tap, a confirmation, but it landed in her body like oxygen. She blocked him on every platform she could think of. Email would come later. Tonight, she needed silence. She took the train south because she couldn't bear to go back to the condo that no longer felt like hers. In the fluorescent belly of the station, surrounded by strangers who didn't know her name, she finally started to shake. Not dramatically, not loudly, just tremors that moved through her ribs like aftershocks. She kept her face still. She'd been trained to. Black women learn early that public grief is often treated as public disorder. At home, her Aunt Renee's apartment, 2 flights up in a building that smelled like warm spices and laundry detergent, she stood in the doorway and tried to speak. The words wouldn't assemble. Renee didn't ask for a story. She just opened her arms, and Imani folded into them like a person who had been holding herself upright too long. In the morning, the internet began writing her ending. It started with the photos. A guest had posted a carousel of the gala, black tie, candlelight, the usual ritual of wealth pretending it was generosity. In the third photo, off to the side, blurred behind a laughing couple, was Imani, caught mid-step, face turned away, eyes wide as if she'd just been struck by something invisible. Someone circled her with a red marker and reposted it. A caption followed. "Who's the woman who got dumped at the Sinclair Gala?" The comments arrived like knives tossed for sport. She knew what she signed up for. Gold digger got outplayed. He upgraded. Sorry. Why bring her at all? That's savage. She looks like she's about to cry. Embarrassing. Then came the think pieces. The subtle cruelty of strangers dressing gossip in moral language. Threads about power couples and social capital. Posts about dating out of your league. Videos with dramatic music and captions like, "When he replaces you with his real type." No one said her name. They didn't need to. The story was more profitable without her humanity attached. Imani's email filled with messages from people she barely knew. Some offered sympathy that felt like tourism, visiting tragedy to feel alive. Others were worse. Advice she didn't ask for, lectures about standards, comments about humility. Her director from the nonprofit wrote one line that made her chest ache. "If you want to come back, your work is still here." The third day, Ethan's emails began. The subject lines were cold and managerial. Respirant for return of property, follow-up time sensitive. Imani stared at the screen, reading as if the words belonged to someone else. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't explaining. He was inventorying. He listed items she needed to return from storage. A watch he claimed was family-owned. A framed photo he'd gifted her from a trip she now couldn't remember without nausea. Clothing he'd purchased on her behalf. Each sentence was precise, clean, stripped of emotion like financial statements. On the fourth email, he added a threat. legal language softened by false politeness. I'd prefer to handle this reasonably. Reasonably. Imani's hands trembled as she scrolled. She felt humiliation rise again, not from the gala, but from the realization that Ethan had already moved into the phase where she became an inconvenience to resolve. That night, she opened her social accounts and stared at them like open wounds. Photos of her smiling beside Ethan at benefits, captions carefully worded, the performance of being chosen. Her own face looked unfamiliar, as if she'd been posing as someone who could survive that world without consequence. She deleted them one by one. Instagram, gone. Twitter, gone. LinkedIn, she paused, then tightened her jaw and deleted it too. When the final confirmation box asked if she was sure, Imani whispered out loud, "Yes." It felt like dropping off the grid, like stepping out of a spotlight she never asked for. And then she did something she hated herself for, something she would never admit to anyone later. She opened a browser and typed a sentence into the search bar with fingers that didn't feel connected to her body. How do I disappear completely? The results loaded instantly. Tips, lists, forums, people explaining vanishing as if it were a life hack. Imani stared at the screen until the letters blurred. She wasn't looking for escape in the dramatic sense. She wasn't trying to die. She was trying to stop existing as a headline written by strangers. Because the internet had already decided what her story meant, and she didn't yet know how to take it back. Imani didn't go to therapy because she believed in it. She went because her Aunt Renee sat across from her at the small kitchen table one Sunday morning, pushed a mug of coffee toward her, and said, without accusation or softness, "You're not broken, but you are bleeding in places you keep pretending don't exist." Renee had raised 2 children alone, survived layoffs, and a marriage that ended quietly but violently in its own way. She didn't dramatize pain, she named it. "You don't need to be strong right now," Renee continued. "You need to be honest, and you don't sound honest with yourself." 2 days later, Imani sat in a narrow office with a window that looked out onto a brick wall and a potted plant that had seen better decades. The therapist, Dr. Althea Morris, was a black woman in her late 40s with a calm voice and eyes that did not rush to fill silence. She didn't smile excessively. She didn't soften her questions. "So," Dr. Morris said, folding her hands, "what made you come in today?" Imani opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her throat tightened with the pressure of all the sentences she'd rehearsed in private. Polite explanations, rational summaries, versions of events that made her sound composed and reasonable and unhurt. She tried to choose one and found she couldn't. Dr. Morris waited. The silence stretched. It wasn't awkward. It was surgical. "I think," Imani said finally, voice thin, "I think I lost something important, and everyone keeps telling me I should be grateful for what I had instead." Dr. Morris nodded once. "That's a good place to start." Over the next sessions, the story came out in fragments. Not the gala first, never the gala, but the smaller things, the corrections, the compromises, the way Imani had learned to scan rooms before speaking, the way love had slowly begun to feel like an audition. Dr. Morris listened without interrupting, then began asking questions that landed with unsettling precision. When did you start believing your needs were negotiable? Who taught you that being chosen was the same as being safe? What did you give up that you haven't allowed yourself to grieve? Imani tried to answer intellectually at first. She spoke about systems, power, race, gender. She analyzed Ethan like a case study. Dr. Morris let her finish, then leaned forward slightly. "That's a very elegant explanation," she said. "Now tell me the truth that scares you." The words hit harder than anything Ethan had ever said. Imani stared at the floor. Her chest burned. She felt ridiculous, dramatic, indulgent. Every accusation she'd ever absorbed rising to keep her quiet. She swallowed, then spoke before she could talk herself out of it. "I thought," she said slowly, "that if someone like him chose me, it would mean I was finally irreplaceable." The room went still. Dr. Morris did not flinch. "Irreplaceable to whom?" "To the world," Imani whispered. To the kind of world that always has a reason why I'm impressive, but not essential. The sentence hung between them, raw and exposed. Imani's eyes filled, and this time she didn't stop it. The tears came hot and sudden, grief she'd been postponing for years, finally demanding to be acknowledged. Dr. Morris handed her a tissue. That, she said gently, is the first honest sentence you've said since you walked in. In the weeks that followed, therapy stopped being a place where Imani explained herself and became a place where she listened. She began to see the pattern, not just with Ethan, but long before him. The overachievement, the emotional fluency, the way she learned to translate herself so others could stay comfortable. You learned early that excellence buys safety, Dr. Morris said one afternoon. But safety isn't the same as belonging. Imani thought about the gala bathroom, about the voices discussing her like an object that had malfunctioned, about how easily she'd accepted shrinking as a fair price for love. I don't know who I am without performing, she admitted. That's not a failure, Dr. Morris replied. That's a starting point. They talked about boundaries, about anger, about the particular exhaustion of being a Black woman in rooms that want your insight, but not your autonomy. About how betrayal hurts differently when it confirms a fear you were already carrying. Slowly, something in Imani loosened. Not healed, healing felt too ambitious, but unknotted enough to breathe. One evening, after a session that left her hollow and clear at the same time, Imani walked out into the street and noticed the city differently. Not as a judge, not as an audience, just as a place where people were living entire lives without knowing her story. For the first time since the gala, that realization didn't feel like erasure. It felt like possibility. She wasn't ready to rebuild yet. She didn't have a plan. She still woke some mornings with the instinct to check her phone, to see what version of her the internet had decided on overnight. But now, when that impulse rose, another thought followed. Quieter, steadier, unfamiliar but real. I am allowed to exist without being chosen. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't strength. It was honesty. And it was enough to begin. The decision did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as exhaustion. Imani realized she couldn't keep circling the same questions. Why did he choose her? Why wasn't I enough? Without losing months, maybe years, to answers that would never satisfy. Therapy had peeled back the wound. Now she needed something harder, more structural, something that would give her hands work to do while her heart learned how to stand again. She enrolled in the program on a rainy Thursday night, sitting at her Aunt Renee's kitchen table with the laptop angled away from the window. Applied analytics in financial modeling for career transitions. Evening classes, weekends, condensed, unforgiving. The confirmation email landed with a polite cheerfulness that made her flinch. For the first time since the gala, she felt fear that wasn't about humiliation. This fear was clean, directional. It asked only one question. Can you actually do this? The first weeks were brutal. Imani was good at the theory, patterns, incentives, how power hid itself inside spreadsheets the way it once hid inside zoning maps. She understood narratives of value instinctively, but the mechanics were merciless. Models broke if you missed a decimal. Assumptions collapsed under scrutiny. The numbers did not care how compelling your intention was. She stayed up late rewatching lectures, fingers cramped from practice problems, coffee replacing sleep with something thinner and more desperate. In class, she was older than some students, less fluent than others, hyper-aware of every mistake. When she asked questions, she heard the old voice whisper, "Don't confirm their doubts." The first exam arrived sooner than she expected. She studied until her eyes burned. She memorized formulas like prayers. She walked into the room telling herself she didn't need to be perfect, just competent. She was wrong. Halfway through the exam, her model failed. Not catastrophically, worse, quietly. A circular reference she couldn't untangle. She froze, watching the clock drain minutes she could not afford. Around her, keyboards clicked with infuriating confidence. When time was called, Imani closed her laptop with a calm that felt borrowed. The grade came back 2 days later. She had failed. Not barely, cleanly. The feedback was brief, professional, devastating. Conceptual strength, execution weak, needs improvement. Imani stared at the screen until the letters rearranged themselves into accusation. Her chest tightened, heat flooding her face the way it had in the gala restroom. The familiar thought rose immediately, slick and convincing. This was a mistake. You don't belong here either. She skipped the next class, then the one after that. On the third night, she sat on her bed staring at the ceiling, the room dark except for the glow of her phone. She drafted an email withdrawing from the program. Polite, reasonable, a retreat disguised as timing. Before she could send it, her phone buzzed. A message from Dr. Morris. "What are you avoiding tonight?" Imani exhaled sharply, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. She went back to class the following week. This time she raised her hand, asked for help, admitted confusion. The admission burned, but something else happened too. No one laughed. The instructor nodded. A classmate offered to walk through the model with her after. Another sent her notes. The world did not end. Progress came slowly after that, unevenly. She passed the next exam, then stumbled again. She learned to sit with the discomfort of being new, of not being exceptional right away. It felt like relearning gravity. When she began applying for analyst roles, the rejections arrived quickly. Impressive background, but not a fit. We're looking for someone with a more traditional profile. Your experience is interesting, but we're moving forward with other candidates. Each no landed with familiar precision. She wondered if this pivot was just another performance, another attempt to earn safety by becoming useful. One afternoon, after her third rejection in a week, Imani sat in the library and let the weight of it press down. She felt foolish for believing reinvention could be clean, for thinking pain could be converted so easily into progress. She opened her notebook and wrote a single sentence, hard enough to dent the page. "If I quit now, I will never know if I failed or if I just stopped." The truth settled her. She didn't need this pivot to redeem her. She needed it to tell her the truth about herself, whether she could stay when things stopped applauding her effort. So she stayed. She rewrote models. She asked sharper questions. She learned where she was weak and worked directly against it. She let go of the fantasy of immediate mastery and replaced it with something sturdier. Persistence without spectacle. The fall had hurt because it stripped her of illusion. But it also did something else. It proved that this time, when the ground gave way, she did not disappear. She caught herself. And that, quietly, changed everything. Imani met Dr. Celeste Park on a night when she was prepared to be invisible. It was a guest lecture at the program, optional, after hours, the kind of event students attended mostly for networking optics. Imani arrived late, took a seat near the back, notebook closed, expectations low. She had learned by then how quickly rooms recalibrated around perceived value, and she was tired of auditioning. Dr. Park didn't look like what Imani expected. No power suit, no aggressive confidence, just a woman in her early 50s with short, silvering hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a posture so relaxed it suggested she had nothing to prove. She spoke without slides at first, walking slowly across the front of the room as if arranging her thoughts in real time. "I spent 20 years building models that were technically correct and morally empty," she said calmly. "Then I realized most markets don't fail because of math. They fail because of who gets excluded from the assumptions." The sentence landed in Imani's chest like recognition. Dr. Park talked about her career, quantitative finance, then impact investing, then leaving firms that treated ethics like a branding exercise. She spoke about power without reverence, about money without romance. When the lecture ended, students rushed forward with questions designed to impress. Imani stayed seated. She was packing up when Dr. Park approached her. "You didn't ask anything," Dr. Park said, not unkindly. "Why?" Imani hesitated. Because I'm still figuring out what questions I'm allowed to ask in rooms like this. Dr. Park studied her for a long moment, then smiled. Not warmly, but accurately. That tells me more than any resume. They sat together in the emptying classroom. Imani explained her background, not defensively, not polished. She talked about community work, about the gala without naming it, about the pivot that still felt unfinished. Dr. Park listened without interrupting, then leaned back. Here's the truth you're circling, she said. You're not confused about finance. You're confused about permission. Imani stiffened. Permission for what? To stop translating yourself, Dr. Park replied. You keep thinking you need to justify why you're here. You don't. But you do need to be precise. Pain is not a credential. The words stung because they were true. I thought my story would matter, Imani said quietly. It will, Dr. Park said. Later, after your competence is undeniable. Right now, your story is trying to do work your skills haven't finished doing yet. Imani felt something shift. Embarrassment, relief, gratitude tangled together. Dr. Park continued. You have excellent instincts. You see second-order effects. You understand how value is framed, not just calculated. But you rush to soften your conclusions. You're afraid of being seen as aggressive. Imani laughed once. I've been called worse. Then stop preemptively shrinking, Dr. Park said. If you want to enter rooms that move capital, you don't get credit for being palatable. You get credit for being right. They talked for another hour about failure, about ambition, about the quiet seduction of elite approval. Dr. Park didn't flatter her. She didn't promise anything. At the end, she pulled out her phone and typed a short email. There's a firm in Chicago, she said, turning the screen so Imani could see. Small, mean learning curve, no tolerance for hand-holding. They back overlooked founders, not because it's virtuous, but because it's mispriced. They need an analyst. Imani's pulse quickened. I don't have the background they'll want. Dr. Park met her eyes. You have the background they can't teach. She paused, then added, one condition. When you interview, do not lead with betrayal. Do not tell them who hurt you. Do not frame this as redemption. Tell them what you see in markets. Let your clarity speak. Imani nodded slowly. And one more thing, Dr. Park said. This path will tempt you to turn anger into fuel. That works for a while. But don't build a career on vengeance. Build it on authorship. Decide what you want to create, not who you want to outperform. Imani stood to leave, feeling something unfamiliar settle into place. Not confidence, not certainty, but alignment. As she reached the door, Dr. Park called after her. Imani, yes? Being underestimated is not your trauma, she said evenly. It's your advantage, if you stop trying to correct it for free. Imani walked out into the night carrying that sentence like a tool she didn't yet know how to use, but already trusted. For the first time since the pivot, she didn't feel like she was running away from who she had been. She felt like she was being introduced, properly, to who she could become. The firm didn't look like power the way movies promised it would. No marble lobby, no panoramic views, just a narrow floor in a converted building near the river. Desks crowded close, whiteboards filled with half-erased equations, coffee rings marking the surfaces where urgency lived. The sign on the door read, Harbor Point Capital, small enough to miss if you weren't looking for it. Imani was. Her interview lasted 3 hours. No one asked her about Ethan. No one asked her why she'd changed careers. They asked her what markets were lying. They asked her where capital was being wasted. They asked her what founders sounded like when they were hiding something. When she answered, she didn't perform. She didn't soften. She didn't apologize for pausing to think. At the end, the managing partner, a woman named Joyce Ramirez with sharp eyes and no patience for mythology, leaned back in her chair. You work like someone who's already lost something, Joyce said. That makes you dangerous. But it also makes you sloppy if you're not careful. Are you here to prove something? Or are you here to build something? Imani didn't answer immediately. She thought of Dr. Park's warning, of therapy, of the temptation to turn anger into a weapon that cut indiscriminately. "I'm here to build," she said finally, "and I'm willing to be corrected." Joyce nodded once. "Good. We start early. Don't be late." The work was relentless. Imani learned quickly that Harbor Point didn't reward visibility, it rewarded accuracy. Analysts were expected to defend every assumption, to kill their own favorite ideas if the numbers demanded it. Meetings were blunt. Feedback was public. Mistakes were noted, not coddled. At first, she flinched, not because she couldn't handle criticism, but because it echoed rooms where correction had meant humiliation. She had to relearn the difference between attack and accountability, between being diminished and being sharpened. She worked late, asked better questions, learned to read pitch decks the way she once read community proposals, listening for what wasn't being said. She noticed patterns others missed. Founders dismissed because their markets didn't look sexy. Products overlooked because the users weren't wealthy. Traction underestimated because it didn't resemble familiar success stories. One night, while reviewing a stack of early-stage opportunities everyone else had passed on, she stopped. A platform serving small municipal contractors, minority-owned, underbanked, locked out of traditional financing. The margins were thin, the model messy. The founders lacked polish, but the data told a different story. But definition was strong. Default rates were low. Demand was persistent because the problem wasn't cyclical, it was structural. Imani built the model twice. Then again. She stress-tested it until the numbers stopped flinching. In the investment meeting, Joyce challenged her immediately. "You're overestimating adoption," Joyce said. "Governments move slowly." Imani didn't retreat. "They do," she agreed. "But vendors move fast when cash flow is the difference between survival and closure. The adoption isn't coming from municipalities. It's coming from necessity." The room went quiet. Joyce stared at the screen, then back at Imani. "Run it again at 15% lower growth." Imani did. The return profile held. They funded the company. It wasn't a headline deal. No press, no champagne. But 6 months later, when the platform doubled revenue quietly, Joyce forwarded the update to the team with a single line. "Good call." The words hit harder than applause. The carry from that deal wasn't life-changing money, but it was something more important. Proof. Imani paid down her remaining debt. She replaced her laptop. She stopped calculating groceries with anxiety humming underneath. More importantly, she noticed what hadn't happened. She hadn't needed to become cruel to win. She hadn't needed to erase parts of herself to sound credible. She didn't dominate rooms. She didn't perform invincibility. She let the work speak. As her confidence grew, so did the invitations. Panels, introductions, quiet conversations over coffee where people asked her what she was seeing, what she thought was mispriced, what she'd do if she were deploying capital herself. She answered honestly. Sometimes she was wrong. When she was, she said so. That too turned out to be currency. One evening, after a long day, she caught her reflection in the office bathroom mirror. Hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, eyes clear in a way they hadn't been in years. She didn't look powerful in the way Ethan once had. She looked present. Imani understood then that winning didn't mean crossing into the rooms that had once rejected her, improving she belonged. It meant building rooms where she didn't have to disappear to stay. She was learning the game. She was winning it. And she was doing so without becoming the kind of person who would ever invite someone to watch their own replacement and call it strategy. The invitation arrived without apology. Sinclair Foundation Annual Benefit Platinum Sponsor, Harbor Point Capital. Requested attendees: Joyce Ramirez, Imani Brooks. Imani read it twice, then once more slowly, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something safer. They didn't. The gala, the room where she had learned, publicly, how replaceable she was supposed to be. The room that had archived her humiliation as etiquette. She didn't feel fear this time. She felt assessment. Joyce noticed the shift in her expression. You don't have to go, she said evenly. Sponsorship buys choice. Imani considered that. Therapy had taught her the difference between avoidance and discernment, between running and deciding. I want to go, she said finally, not to prove anything, to see who I am in that space now. Joyce nodded. Then go as yourself, not armor, not history. The night of the gala, Chicago looked the same. Stone facades washed in light, black cars lining the curb, donors moving with the confidence of people used to being mirrored back at themselves. Imani stepped out of the car in a tailored dress that didn't soften her or sharpen her. It simply fit. Her hair was pulled back, precise, practical. No performance, no disguise. Inside, the room unfolded as it always had. Curated warmth, expensive restraint, conversations that pretended to be casual while tracking advantage. Names drifted toward her and then stalled. Recognition recalibrating. She saw it happen in real time. The pause, the second look, the quiet confusion. People knew her face but couldn't place her where they used to. She wasn't beside anyone. She wasn't waiting. She was introduced clearly, cleanly, as Imani Brooks, partner, Harbor Point Capital. The title changed the air. Marin Sinclair approached first. She looked older, not in years but in awareness. Her smile was warm, genuine, unguarded. Imani, she said, I'm really glad you came. There was no defensiveness in her tone, no territory marking, just recognition. Thank you for the invitation, Imani replied. The initiative looks promising. Marin nodded, relieved. It is, and your firm's sponsorship, she paused. That matters. It's an investment, Imani said calmly. The data supports it. Something like respect flickered across Marin's face. I'd love to talk more, she said, about board involvement. We need people who understand capital without confusing it for virtue. Before Imani could respond, the room shifted. She felt it the way you feel pressure change before a storm. Ethan stood across the ballroom, mid-conversation, frozen. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not diminished, just ordinary. The effortless certainty she'd once mistaken for strength had softened into something cautious. When their eyes met, recognition spread across his face in stages. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been regret. Imani did not look away. She didn't need to. She turned back to Marin and said, have your assistant reach out. We'll coordinate. Marin smiled. Of course. Imani moved through the room after that with unhurried precision. She spoke to donors about portfolio strategy, to journalists about capital access, to younger women about career pivots without mythologizing them. She laughed when something was funny. She declined when something wasn't aligned. She did not scan for approval. Ethan waited near the exit. She recognized the posture immediately, the rehearsed humility, the careful positioning of vulnerability. When she reached him, he cleared his throat. Imani, he said, can we talk? She tilted her head slightly. About what? About us, he said, then corrected himself. About what happened. I owe you an apology. 3 years ago, those words would have unraveled her. Now they landed without impact, like currency from a country she no longer lived in. You don't owe me anything, she said evenly. We were in a relationship. It ended. The way it ended, he insisted. That wasn't fair. No, she agreed. It wasn't. He waited, as if expecting anger, tears, something he could respond to. Instead, she continued. But it taught me something valuable. I had allowed myself to be assessed instead of authored. I shrank to fit into a life that was never going to make room for me. She met his eyes, not confrontational, not kind, accurate. So, she said, if anything, I'm grateful. Ethan blinked. Grateful? Yes, she said, because I stopped disappearing. The words settled between them, final and complete. She adjusted her coat and stepped past him. He did not follow. Outside, the night air was cool and steady. The city moved as it always had, unimpressed, alive, unconcerned with who had been chosen or replaced. Imani paused at the curb, breath filling her lungs, and understood something with quiet certainty. The room couldn't name her anymore because she no longer belonged to its old story. She had written a new one. And this time, she did not need permission to stand in it. The first time Imani understood that her life had become something larger than recovery was not at a gala, or in a boardroom, or on a stage. It was in a small conference room with bad lighting and folding chairs, where a young woman sat across from her, gripping a notebook like a life raft. "I think I'm failing," the woman said quietly. "Everyone keeps telling me my idea is unrealistic, that I should be grateful just to be in the room." Imani didn't interrupt. She recognized the cadence, the careful self-blame, the way ambition was already being negotiated down to something more acceptable. "What do your numbers say?" Imani asked. The woman blinked. "They're strong. Retention is high. Growth is steady." "Then you're not failing," Imani said. "You're being underestimated. And those are not the same thing." The woman exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for years. That was when Imani realized the circuit had closed. What began as humiliation had become infrastructure. What once threatened to erase her had taught her how erasure works and how to interrupt it. She had learned to read power, to build leverage, to refuse narratives that depended on her shrinking. And now she could pass that knowledge on without resentment, without needing to be seen as the hero of the story. She didn't erase her past. She repurposed it. Harbor Point's mentorship fund grew quietly, efficiently. Not charity, investment. Not saviors, partners. Companies scaled. Founders who'd been told no found themselves saying, "not yet," instead of "never." The returns came, but they were not the point. The point was continuity. One evening, walking home along the river, city lights broken into fragments by the water, Imani thought about the woman she had been, the one standing barefoot in a condo, learning about her replacement through a screen. She didn't feel anger anymore. She felt distance, the kind earned by growth. Legacy, she understood, wasn't about winning the room that once rejected you. It was about building rooms where rejection had less power. It was about refusing to disappear and then making sure others didn't have to either. Imani stopped at the railing and watched the current move forward, relentless and patient. The city hummed behind her. Somewhere, someone was being underestimated. Somewhere else, someone was deciding whether to stay small for love, for safety, for permission. She hoped they'd find this story in time. And if this ending resonated, if you've ever been replaced, underestimated, or told to make yourself smaller to belong, share this story. Like it. Comment with the part that stayed with you. Follow for more stories about power, rebuilding, and choosing yourself without apology. Because stories don't just entertain. Sometimes they complete the circuit for someone who's still finding their way back.